I'm Jay Sullivan, although I go on the didactics by James, and I've been a sculptor for, God, I guess what, 35 years or so, and I teach sculpture. I teach at Southern Methodist University, and teach sculpture and drawing mostly, and then sometimes printmaking and sometimes theory. And those are all, involved here in this show. I did my graduate work in California at Cal State Long Beach, and then kind of did a cross-country set of hops. So taught at Wichita State for 3 years, and then Amherst College in Massachusetts for 6 years, and then came down to Dallas. And to me, that's always seemed kind of normal, maybe because I grew up in the Midwest, and the Midwest always presented itself as some place that you left. So the idea of going to different places was good, and I also like different environments. So I was lucky enough to work in Berlin on 3 different occasions. First with a fellowship from Philip Morris, and so produced a fair amount of work there, and I've exhibited both in Germany and the United States, going back and forth, and but primarily work out of Dallas and do exhibitions within Texas, and exhibited at the Museum of South Texas, did a large retrospective at the Meadows Museum in Dallas, but kind of think of myself more as, I like the practice of being a studio artist. I like the idea of following a practice that evolves over a number of years, where you get to see, where production becomes a form of thought. And I don't so much think of making sculptures as I do of, thinking about three-dimensional stuff. And I've been lucky enough to have a good gallery for the whole time that I've been in Dallas, Conduit Gallery, and she keeps putting up with my musings. So that's good. Well, it's a wonderful space, and it's interesting because in thinking about this space, part of the problem is that it is such a structured space. And so trying to figure out how, obviously I like structures because I build the tables for the objects and all that, so I like to create a space, but this is another space that contains all of those created spaces, and so that was a very interesting problem to deal with. And yeah, and in fact, that once before when I was working in Germany in 1994, I got invited to do an installation at the Berliner Dom, the cathedral in the former East, which was now not the former East. It was after the wall had fallen. But they had this exhibition program in there, and the head of the cathedral asked me if I would be interested in installing some figures in there, and so. That was a real space, and it had all the Kaisers and all of that stuff, and so it was back to effigies, and that was rather interesting because I built 2 figures, one of which was standing, and the other of which was, in German, is umgekehrt, was inverted, so it was on its head, and they were installed on either side of the altar within the sacristy, and were used during the service for All Souls Day. And that was pretty interesting to be in that space. When we were installing them, what was rather funny was a couple of the technicians from the Bildhauer Werkstatt where I work were helping me install these things, which was kind of difficult. And we're working, and one of them, Andreas, says to me, he said, you've created a controversy. And I kind of go, what? I've been worrying about this. And he kind of points out, and the cathedral always had these busloads of tourists that would come through, and I look out, and there are 2 groups of German tourists who are there who are arguing vehemently with each other, and the argument was whether or not what I was doing was blasphemy or whether or not it was sacred. And so, I mean, and there were these two camps, you know, and one wanted me to tear everything out and the other wanted me to keep going. So that was kind of interesting. So one of the, you know, art is often in predetermined locations that are kind of cleaned up for it. So I really like using spaces that are actual real spaces that have different purposes and different functions, and, you know, have a structure that was built for something else than it's being used now. So that's one of the exciting things about this as a location. You know, we have an idea of, we grow up with an idea of what art is and, you know, what artists are, and we've kind of mystified that. And, you know, so the idea that somebody can make a picture seems to us to be very, you know, most people to be very elusive. So you were asking when I got, at least I had been interested in art, I had done ceramics, but when I got interested in sculpture, it was through a teacher at Yale, Irwin Hauer, who presented in his first lecture a very, very conceptual construction of how space and time related. And you could say that that was a little bit like the drawing on the right side of the brain. That was for me, it was a philosophical hook, because I was studying philosophy, that I said, well, yeah, I mean, this is exactly what I can do. So, you know, sculpture appeared to me to be some kind of three-dimensional philosophy. And so that was a very, very easy entree. And then it was very easy to shift most of my interests from philosophy to I'd always been on the periphery a little bit of philosophy of psychology and philosophy of religion, and then to incorporate aesthetics in that. And so that was a pretty easy shift that then allowed me to think about art in ways that, you know, did kind of perhaps trick me into thinking I could do this thing. Yeah, this course had a kind of constructive aspect where we worked a lot with very structural problems in wire, but then we modeled first from dinosaur bones and then did a head. And that was one thing, because it turned out that for whatever reason, maybe because I had built things all my life, I was very good at modeling. So I could, and again, it was modeling not so much in an intuitive way, but rather as a structural way. So I could work a procedure of how to build something with clay, you know, in space. So that I was still staying fairly consistent to things that didn't feel artistic in the sense of inspirational and emotional, but you know, I could get images, and I could then play with images. I could figure out ways to attack them that were of interest to me. So that's, you know, that was you know, in a sense it was an odd beginning, and later on I had a very good friend, two good friends. One, he studied architecture and she was an illustrator, and I lived with them in Italy for a while, and later on I met her. She was in Washington, D.C., and I was showing her work that I was doing in graduate school, and she said something. She said, yeah, it was always so hard watching you work because you really didn't have any talent, but you wanted to do it so much. And so she said, it's nice to see you doing these things. So it's like, so what do you mean I didn't have talent? I was angry. But I guess it was just something that I was, you know, obsessed with as a problem. So talent didn't enter into it. Well, and also we view talent always within a preconceived image of what talent looks like. So if you say to somebody you're talented, it means that they can produce something that you've already seen. Yeah. But then what do you do about somebody who's going to produce something that's never been seen? You would have no way of knowing that they were talented because you wouldn't have had that structure to fit them into. So, you know, my background was in, let's call it classical figure modeling. And in graduate school, part of the reason why I was at graduate school in Long Beach State was that there was a very good sculptor there, Steve Werlick, who worked with the figure. And so we, you know, I was putting up, 2 life-size figures a semester, kind of working on them simultaneously, modeled in clay. And I ultimately was very bothered by them because I didn't like for some reason, I didn't believe in the outcome of a figure as, shall we say, revealing something about anatomy, or else being some kind of willful deviation from that was deemed as expressive. So that both of those paths seem to be traps. I wanted something that definitely was a figure and came into our space and we knew to be a figure, but I didn't want it to be, even though I'd studied a lot of anatomy and was already dissecting from cadavers, I wasn't interested in that kind of image. So I did a lot of experimentation and ultimately ended up building figures that were in ceramic clay. And they were large, and partly because they were going to be fired and they were large, and probably for other philosophical reasons, I got interested in the form of the effigy and tomb sculpture. And maybe because it was an expression of the body that was as stuff. So, and you know, the show is very much about things as stuff. But also there were image conundrums within tomb figures, whether or not it was supposed to look like it was dead, whether it was supposed to look like it was alive. And so I was doing a lot of research, art historical research on them. And so I was making these large effigy figures. They were basically reclining figures in simple poses. But I was building them up with these slabs of clay that were just laid over simple bamboo armatures that would burn out. And then they were chopped up into sections and fired. So already I was kind of trying to work with the figure materially as a structural thing, not as an image of a thing that would then be cast into another material. I was already interested in it being direct in that way. So if I was working on it, I was working on it. I didn't have to wait 4 or 5 months down the line. And then when I shifted to, when I first taught at Wichita, which was after graduate school at Wichita State, then I was a little bothered by the fact that even with this structural clay, you were wrapping up the thing most of the time, and then you were unwrapping it and working on it, and then you would wrap it back up. So that, again, it wasn't in my space. So that became the problem, was how was I going to build a figure that while I was working on it was in my space and I was standing up against. And that's when I began to play around, and you know, the chair of the department had quarter horses, and one day he gave me a bale of straw. You know, he just said, you know, you're playing around with so much other stuff, here's this. So I started using that with plaster. I was also making crow effigies, because they have all of these huge rooks of crows that would come through in the wintertime, and then they would try to chase them away by shooting them, and so they would say, here, these are a health hazard, and then they'd go around shooting crows and leaving the bodies on the ground. So I did this faculty show once where I took, it was actually kind of, it was a little crude, but I basically filled a vat with these old crow bodies, and I put it in the museum in the faculty show, fully intending for them to decay, which they didn't like. But I was also then building, first with the straw and plaster, I was building these crow bodies, and then taking the feet and putting them on it. And so that was kind of this first idea of making this bundle. And that was what evolved into the figures, first always attached to a structure so that I didn't have to worry about how to hold it up. So they were first sitting in chairs and things like that I was also building out of wood, but then eventually moving to a full standing figure. And I liked it partly because I could work life-size relatively quickly. And I also liked the interplay between the inner structure, which most times at that point was wood, and the outer structure, so that I could play back and forth between the line where the armature was the thing, as versus it being covered up and that being the thing. And that's obviously still present today, that I like the method of construction to be seen, and I like one to be aware of the idea that this body has come together and has been put together. And then the other aspect is that I've always been interested in our ability to see how things feel. So that when we look at something, yes, we're looking at an image, but we're also implicitly feeling it with our hand. And so, the idea of, we have brick and wood and all of that, and we're making determinations. If I was running around and I had to choose a place to run into, I'd choose the wood and not the brick, because my eye tells me and my hand tells me that wood is somehow softer, even though they're both very hard. So, so I like the idea that you can build something in a material that projects its own sense of strength or fragility. And of course, one of the ironies about the figurative work is that everybody looks at it and sometimes they say, well, can I touch it? And they're absolutely afraid that if they touch it, it's just going to crumble into dust. And yet, I've got figures in the studio that I've shipped maybe 2 times back and forth to Germany and all of that stuff. And yeah, they produce a certain amount of rubble, but they're always there. They don't get ruined. They just evolve to a slightly different state. It's something that I enjoy. So first, with the objects, partly through, if I back up a little bit, partly through the work that I do in Taos, because I teach there every summer, and with a friend, we take long walks, usually early in the morning. So I'm very aware that this environment is, on the one hand, it's a natural environment, but it's also an early Pueblo site after the Anasazi came out of Chaco and western New Mexico and moved into the Rio Grande Valley. So, I'm very aware, because the way in which New Mexico holds things in a kind of timeless state, that you're looking at something which is simultaneously maybe 800 years old as well as present, and it's almost impossible to really tell the difference. So there are a lot of objects, artifacts that are present, and even organizations of objects that may be natural organizations. I mean, certainly the sherds and the artifacts are obviously, from the inhabitants, but mostly the organization of the landscape, how things appear to you. You can't quite tell if that's something that happened, due to some natural cause, or if it was something that happened due to this desire that we have to organize the environment. So I'm always aware that things, natural things, are also man-made things, and vice versa. Man-made things are in themselves natural, or become naturalized. And so I had always collected things, and usually out of this confusion of what was really as it seemed and what was different than as it seemed. And also on top of this, old Pueblo site was a logging operation, and there's all the detritus from that. So that was another kind of civilization that had gone and departed and had left stuff behind. So there would be patterns, year to year. Like sometimes I might be interested in just little chunks of wood that were left over from the logging operation. And that actually sponsored the Figure with Rocks, which was based on an image of Philip, my friend, coming back, and we would always have this stuff, so we'd stick things in pockets and all of that, and for some reason he had been picking up chunks of wood. They weren't rocks, but he was holding them here because he had a lot of them, and he didn't want them to fall. And in actuality, there was absolutely no reason to be interested in those chunks of wood. They were just drop-offs from a logging operation. So then there's this question of, well, why are you interested in them? And some of that is from a very tactile basis, and then some of that is from one's own confusion, that you might pick up something and it might then reveal itself to be something other than you thought it was. So you might have thought that it was light, and you pick it up and it actually is heavy and solid. So when I began building from these things that I was picking up, I always thought of that as making both analogs of form, but also, analogs in material, and what would happen if you, and I'm also very aware, for example, of the shift between what I'll call a bodily geometry or a solid geometry to a surface geometry, which to me is a very, very interesting problem. The way that you kind of map a surface is very different than the way you accrete and get to a surface. So that kind of prefigured the, shall we say, the material game of some of these things, particularly the brass objects against the rocks. And because we do have I work with materials all the time, so I'm very aware of their differences, but most people, we don't have tinkerers anymore, so most people haven't seen things that have been fabricated out of tin or things like that. So they don't really have, there's a part of our history and education and training that's missing. And so that's what they run into when they pick it up. They say, oh wait, it's light. I thought it was solid because it was made out of metal, and I thought that metal would be solid. I first took it in as a way, it's interesting because I had been playing around with computer modeling for actually a fairly long time when it was first out. There was a program called Maya, and Silicon Graphics was one of the first companies that was actually producing workstations. And most of this was done for animation and movies and all of that stuff. But early on I took a course in that and did a couple of seminars and bought myself a workstation. And in part I was interested in it on my own terms, just as how does one represent within a weightless, materialless, in a sense spaceless world, how does one represent things? And also my wife was a medical illustrator, and she had a little bit of an interest in being able to make three-dimensional models that could then be manipulated within the computer. So she was also doing some of this, and we were kind of working back and forth. But really it was ultimately that I became fascinated in how this form of working would construct a thing. And the most important thing to me was that there was this program that had just come out that people really didn't quite know how to use, that involved the use of what's called a phantom device. It's an arm that has 6 degrees of freedom that's hooked into the computer. This program created objects in a virtual clay, and this arm, this stylus, allowed you to both feel that thing as a solid thing and also to manipulate it. So you could do traditional modeling things to it. You could carve it, you could cut into it, you could add to it, as well as doing kind of normal computer-aided design things. Like you could generate images, just as if they were CAD images, but then they would be physical. And so I just kind of set about, and I had a very nice donor who gave me 1 year, kind of $10,000, and just said, well, play with it, for the school. So I bought this system, and then I just kind of set up a very simple project because I wanted to learn how to do it. So I just said, well, I've got all of these things that I pick up. I'm just going to start modeling them. So I'm going to take one a week, and I'm going to model it in the computer, and I'm going to look at different ways that I can generate them and different things that I can do with them, just as a way to get started. So that was kind of the beginning, and that again had some incredibly fascinating philosophical problems. Like there was an early piece that I made where I just literally modeled it like I was banging clay together, and it was a pear, because that's one of my archetypical objects that I give to students. And so I built this in the computer, and then the engineering department had a 3D printer. So I printed it. And one of the things that happened with it was that you could apply a texture to it. So it had these images in there, the photographic images in black and white, and you could emboss a surface with it. And early on I found that you could emboss one of the pictures was of a, quote, cloud. And early on I found that using this cloud image and embossing things, they got very rock-like very quickly. So that was, at the beginning itself, a very strange notion that you were embossing a thing with a cloud and getting a rock. So that was kind of fun. And then I found that when I printed them, because the embossing was done photographically, there were certain aspects of the image that would be out of focus, literally. And I had never conceived of the idea that a 3D thing could be out of focus in any way, shape, or form. So that itself was kind of interesting. And so those kind of strange sidelights were, to me, very philosophically interesting. So even if the objects that I was working on were incredibly stupid and boring, these little conceptual glitches were very interesting to me, and that kept me going. And then also because slowly, there were all sorts of things that would get spun off from this. So I could, I assembled other programs and I could generate drawings from what I was making. And those drawings were quite interesting, again, because they had this very absolute non-perspective view. It was of a thing, but it was very ambiguous because it didn't really have any space. Everything was compressed into a graphic image. And those were interesting. Those were interesting to me in terms of drawing, and also I began to generate prints from them. So it was this, it wouldn't have worked if it didn't spin off interesting artifacts. If it had only been the idea that I had to make, an image, so I had to make a rock in the computer and have it print and look like the rock that I made, that would have been as worthless at that point as the early figure modeling had been. But there were these other things that were happening, and that was also what kept me interested in them. And so it fit right into the kind of thinking that I was doing, just playing with things themselves. There's enough messiness in there that it stayed interesting. I had always done bronze casting, but I'd always been interested in cast iron, which is to me the most primitive form of casting. And I had done some experiments with it before, but then I began to realize that I had these computer files that I could easily manipulate and make patterns for cast iron pieces. And so then I actually really began to use the computer much more as a standard manufacturing tool, so that I could generate things that would allow me to make things that would have at that point been harder to make in real life, straight out. And I could make patterns and I could get them cast, and then I could actually get the mold for the cast iron piece cast and cast things that were much more organic and much less structured than cast iron usually has to be, because cast iron usually works from a very, very determined geometry in the patterns. So that's been another interest, that moving into this material, but again in a way in which the material presents itself as something other than it is. So that the hive piece, which was generated from a wasp nest, a mud dauber nest, has a strange floppiness to it that you just can't really associate with cast iron. So again, there's this play of things as they seem and things not as they seem. The patterns are often traditionally made out of wood. You have one in the back room up there. I make them I make mine out of plaster, which also was an old material that was used for that. So
when you give that to this little guy down in Beaumont, does he make a wooden?
No, he actually
uses that. He
accepts it. In fact, that was quite interesting, because when I was making these plaster molds, he actually didn't believe that they would work. I said, no, they'll work. Because they were very strong and reinforced. And also, I knew it to have been, at least for certain cases, a temporary pattern. I mean, the reason why the patterns are usually made out of wood is that, they're doing thousands of castings of some plumbing part, so it was just a matter of the pattern being durable for all of those casts. But, you know, if you're only making a few, it's easy to make it out of plaster or something else. And again, that has a different feeling to it and a different sense of it. Early on, it clearly became the case that if these things were going to survive, it wasn't because of the outer materials, it was because of the inner structure. So I make a pretty strong thing. And also that allows me a lot of flexibility while I'm working, because it's very easy for me to totally reorganize a figure and to cut it up and then just to open sections up and re-weld in between. So the steel was ultimately more flexible than the wood. I mean, the wood felt more flexible at the beginning because it was fast and it was provisional and you could put something up and not think about it. And the steel you thought about a little bit more. But ultimately it allowed me much more work while I was making the piece itself. So I was able to, you know, I could say, well, I'm starting off with something that I think is going to be a standing figure, and then I could at some point decide that I wanted it to walk, or I wanted it to hang, or I wanted it to be, you know, upside down, or I wanted it to be horizontal, and I could make those shifts. Again, with this idea that, you know, I wanted the figure to be like a real body, in the sense that I can take a real body and I can, you know, I can turn you, you know, upside down and on your side and all of that. I wanted to be able to do those things with it, and so this structure has allowed me to do that. Yeah, that's kind of the newest. That's kind of the newest arm, alongside the, you know, the 3D prints. I mean, the two are kind of developing, and I think that really part of the reason that the cast iron seems newest, because it gives a very different, it's a different quality of a piece. And, you know, I should say that, you know, in the entryway to the show, you know, I've got this one cast iron object called Bulbous, and then I've got a female figure next to it. And the female figure, you know, was modeled based upon measurements from my wife, you know, who died 2 years ago. And the cast iron, I think, to me at that point was very, oddly, was very soothing, because early on I began to think of these objects as being obdurate and things that just wouldn't go away. And you know, and I was obviously obvious of my wife going away. So the material of the cast iron itself became, you know, an anchor, as anchors are cast iron. And that was important to me. And also, in that sense, too, the early forms, the simplicity of the forms, and the kind of the inability to know exactly what it is. You know, certain of them come from rocks, certain of them come from other forms, but, you know, it's really kind of hard to say what the origin of Bulbous would be. So it seems fully formed, and it's, you know, it's so integral and so, yeah, obdurate, that. And you have it suspended. And I have it suspended, so yeah, it's, you know, it's now floating in space. So that's, you know, that was also, that's part of the reason of the importance of cast iron right now, is I like things that aren't going to go away.
Or aren't what they seem.
Yeah.